2,000 years ago, a Roman emperor wrote private notes to himself in a tent on the edge of the known world. Centuries later, an American general led a starving army through frozen fields, unsure if his country would even survive. A president held a fractured nation together without hatred. A modern fighter pilot endured years of torture with nothing but his mind intact. Different centuries, different enemies, different battlefields. Yet beneath all of it, they were running the same mental operating system, not a strategy, not a personality trait, but a disciplined inner code built for chaos, pressure, and responsibility. This code is Stoicism. Some of these leaders studied it directly, like Marcus Aurelios, who turned philosophy into a daily survival practice. Others, like Abraham Lincoln, arrived at the same principles through suffering, failure, and relentless self-examination. They learned how to act without panic, how to lead without ego, how to remain steady when everything around them collapsed. Welcome to the Stoic Lighthouse. This is where ancient wisdom cuts through modern confusion, where clarity replaces noise, and where leadership begins not with power over others, but mastery over the self. If this kind of thinking matters to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this lighthouse reach more people navigating the same storms. Today, we're breaking down the Stoic code behind 5 giants of history, 5 leaders, 5 moments of extreme pressure, and 5 timeless lessons that still apply to your life today. Number 1. Marcus Aurelios. Duty over desire. Marcus Aurelios never wanted to be emperor. That fact alone already separates him from most people who seek power. His private writings reveal a man who longed for quiet study, reflection, and philosophical calm. But fate had other plans. The Roman world was placed on his shoulders, not as a reward, but as a burden, and he accepted it. For nearly 2 decades, Marcus Aurelius ruled from military camps along the frozen frontiers of the Danube. Far from Rome's marble halls, he slept in tents, endured disease, betrayal, and endless war. He despised violence, yet he understood something most leaders avoid. Duty does not ask for your preferences. For the Stoics, this obligation was called officium. It meant fulfilling your role in the larger human community, regardless of personal comfort. Marcus Aurelius did not see himself as elevated above others. He saw himself as assigned. Each morning, before commanding legions, he fought a more difficult battle against resistance, fear, and self-pity. In his private journal, he reminded himself, Marcus Aurelius reflected, "At dawn, when you struggle to get out of bed, tell yourself, I am rising to do the work of a human being." This was not the voice of ambition. It was the voice of service. He believed leadership was not about dominance, but contribution, not about control, but responsibility. In Stoic thought, humanity was a single living organism, and every person had a function within it. The modern philosopher William B. Irvine explains this mindset clearly. William B. Irvine explains, Marcus Aurelius viewed Stoicism as a philosophy of responsibility. Like a bee in a hive, his role was to work for the good of the whole, even at great personal cost. This idea stretches back to Plato, who argued that the best rulers are those who do not crave authority, but accept it out of necessity. The man who desires power least may be the one most fit to carry it. Marcus Aurelius embodied that paradox. He did not ask whether his task felt fair. He did not ask whether it aligned with his desires. He asked only one question: what must be done? That is the Stoic foundation of leadership. True authority begins when ego steps aside and duty takes its place. The strongest leaders are not those who demand service, but those who willingly give it. And that lesson remains just as unforgiving today. Number 2. George Washington. Resilience when everything is lost. If Marcus Aurelius teaches leadership through duty, George Washington teaches it through endurance. Before becoming a national symbol, Washington was a general on the brink of failure, Again and again, he faced a professional British army with untrained volunteers, empty supply lines, political infighting, and a nation that barely believed in itself. By every conventional metric, the American cause should have collapsed. The breaking point came during the winter of 1777 at Valley Forge. The army was starving. Soldiers lacked coats, shoes, and basic medical care. Disease spread faster than hope. Desertion was constant. Mutiny was a real possibility. Washington could not control any of it. The weather, the shortages, the incompetence of Congress, the overwhelming strength of the enemy. But he understood something instinctively Stoic. Control begins and ends in the mind. Epictetus, the Stoic teacher of inner freedom, defined this boundary with brutal clarity. Epictetus taught, some things are up to us, and some things are not. Washington lived this principle without ever naming it. He did not waste energy on rage or self-pity. He focused on discipline, example, and presence. He walked the camps. He shared the suffering of his men. He embodied steadiness when panic would have been justified. Resilience, in the Stoic sense, is not emotional numbness. It is emotional mastery. Washington felt the despair. He read reports predicting defeat. He knew the odds were against him. But he refused to let despair dictate his actions. His composure became a stabilizing force. When leaders remain unbroken, they prevent collapse in others. The military historian John Keegan captured this quality precisely. John Keegan explained, "Resilient leaders are not those who avoid defeat, but those who endure it without surrendering their sense of purpose." Washington had no guarantee of victory. What he had was commitment to the role he had accepted. He did not ask whether success was likely. He asked whether quitting was honorable. Decades later, Viktor Frankl would articulate the same psychological truth after surviving the concentration camps. Viktor Frankl wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response." Washington chose resolve over reaction. And in doing so, he demonstrated a core Stoic law of leadership. When circumstances are uncontrollable, character becomes the final battlefield. Victory begins long before outcomes change. It begins the moment a leader refuses to break internally. Number 3, Frederick the Great, ruling the mind through reason. Frederick the Great ruled in an age of absolute monarchs, kings who governed by impulse, tradition, and personal vanity, men who believed power existed to satisfy desire. Frederick rejected that model entirely. He called himself the first servant of the state. More than a military genius, Frederick was a disciplined mind. He immersed himself in philosophy, corresponded with Enlightenment thinkers, and studied Stoic principles not as theory, but as restraint. For him, leadership was not the freedom to act on emotion. It was the obligation to master it. At the center of Stoic psychology lies the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty of the mind. The Stoics believed that every failure of leadership begins here, when emotion overrides judgment. Frederick understood this danger intimately. He wrote bluntly about the necessity of reason over passion. Frederick the Great argued, "The wise man does not submit to his passions. He examines them, restrains them, and places them under the rule of reason." This was not moral posturing. It was operational discipline. As King of Prussia, Frederick reformed legal systems, promoted religious tolerance, and insisted that laws serve rational order rather than personal authority. On the battlefield, his greatest advantage was not aggression, but clarity. While others reacted emotionally to defeat or surprise, Frederick calculated. Stoic logic, refined by Chrysippus, taught that reason is not coldness, it is stability. Emotion clouds judgment precisely when judgment is most needed. The modern author William B. Irvine notes that Stoicism was historically attractive to those in power for a reason. William B. Irvine explains, Stoicism offered leaders a way to resist the intoxication of authority. It reminded them that power without self-command quickly turns destructive. Frederick's reign was not free from violence or ambition. He waged brutal wars and expanded his territory aggressively. But what makes him a Stoic case study is not perfection, it is struggle. He fought constantly against his own impulses. Socrates once warned that the unexamined life leads to tyranny, not wisdom. Frederick took that warning seriously. He believed leadership demanded continuous internal surveillance. This is the Stoic lesson he leaves behind. A leader who cannot govern his own mind will eventually misuse every external power he holds. Reason is not an intellectual luxury, it is a moral safeguard, and without it, authority collapses into chaos. Number 4. Abraham Lincoln. Greatness without hatred. Abraham Lincoln led a nation at war with itself. No foreign enemy, no clear moral comfort, only division, resentment, and bloodshed on an industrial scale. The American Civil War was not just a military conflict, it was a moral fracture. Brothers fought brothers, families split, entire regions defined themselves by hatred. In that environment, Lincoln chose a path few leaders would dare to take. He refused to hate. This was not weakness. It was discipline at the highest level. Stoicism teaches that justice is not vengeance, and strength is not cruelty. At its most elevated form, justice becomes sympatheia, the understanding that all human beings belong to the same moral body. Marcus Aurelius expressed this principle with ruthless simplicity. Marcus Aurelius reflected, "What brings no benefit to the hive brings none to the bee." Lincoln understood the United States as a fractured hive. His goal was not to humiliate the defeated South, but to restore the whole. He saw Confederate soldiers not as monsters, but as fellow Americans trapped by history, culture, and fear. This mindset reached its peak in his second inaugural address. With victory already in sight, Lincoln could have chosen triumph. Instead, he chose restraint. Lincoln declared, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right." That sentence is a Stoic manifesto. Seneca warned that anger gives the illusion of strength while quietly destroying reason. Seneca argued, "The greatest remedy for anger is delay." Lincoln delayed vengeance entirely. While many demanded punishment, Lincoln focused on reconciliation. He understood that nations, like individuals, cannot heal while feeding resentment. Justice without mercy becomes another form of violence. The historian John Meacham captured this rare quality in Lincoln's character. John Meacham observed, Lincoln possessed the capacity to hold moral conviction without moral arrogance. He could judge actions without dehumanizing the people who committed them. This is the Stoic apex of leadership, to see clearly without hatred, to act firmly without cruelty, to pursue justice without ego. In an age of polarization, Lincoln's lesson is unforgiving. Leadership is not proven by how fiercely you attack your enemies, but by how much of your humanity you preserve while confronting them. That is greatness without hatred. Number 5. James Stockdale, the inner citadel under torture. James Stockdale did not rule an empire. He did not command a nation. He ruled something far more difficult, his own mind. In 1965, Stockdale was shot down over North Vietnam. As he ejected from his aircraft, he already knew what awaited him: years of imprisonment, torture, isolation, uncertainty. He would spend 7.5 years as a prisoner of war in the infamous Hanoi Hilton. From the moment he was captured, everything external was stripped away. No control over food, no control over pain, no control over time, no control over survival itself. Yet Stockdale entered captivity with something his captors could never reach. A philosophy he had studied years earlier at Stanford: Stoicism. At the center of Stoic survival lies the concept of the inner citadel, a mental stronghold no external force can penetrate unless you surrender it. Epictetus, the former slave whose writings guided Stockdale, taught this with merciless clarity. Epictetus warned, "No one can harm you unless you consent to it." Stockdale understood this not as comfort, but as responsibility. His captors could break his body. They could not force belief. They could not command meaning. They could not occupy his hegemonicon, the ruling faculty of choice. That distinction became the difference between collapse and resistance. Stockdale used his inner freedom to lead. As the highest-ranking American officer in the camp, he created a secret code of conduct among prisoners. He enforced communication, mutual resistance, and dignity. He endured beatings rather than betray others. He disfigured himself to avoid being used for propaganda. This was Stoicism stripped of theory. No books, no lectures, no comfort, only choice. The management thinker Jim Collins later described this mindset as the Stockdale paradox. Jim Collins explained, "You must retain unwavering faith that you will prevail in the end, and at the same time confront the most brutal facts of your current reality. That paradox is pure Stoic discipline. Accept reality without illusion. Refuse despair without fantasy." Stockdale did not hope his way through captivity. He endured with structure, meaning, and self-command. His faith was not emotional, it was philosophical. His survival proves the final Stoic truth of leadership. When everything external is taken, character is all that remains. And if the mind remains unconquered, freedom still exists. This is the inner citadel, and it cannot be breached. Across centuries, continents, and battlefields, these 5 men faced radically different challenges. Yet none of them relied on charisma, luck, or circumstance to lead. They relied on order within. Marcus Aurelios showed that leadership begins with duty, not desire. George Washington proved that resilience is forged when hope is scarce. Frederick the Great demonstrated that reason is the only safeguard against power. Abraham Lincoln revealed that justice without hatred is the highest form of strength. James Stockdale embodied the final truth, that freedom lives in the mind, even when the body is imprisoned. Together, they expose a reality modern culture prefers to ignore. Leadership is not a title. Authority is not volume. Strength is not emotional reaction. True power comes from a disciplined inner life. This is why Stoicism continues to surface wherever pressure is highest. It is not a philosophy of comfort. It is a philosophy for those who must act clearly when everything is at stake. Now we want to hear from you. Which of these 5 leaders impacted you the most and why? And which historical figure do you believe also lived by this Stoic code? Share your thoughts in the comments. This community grows through reflection, not noise. If this video brought clarity to your thinking, support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing to the Stoic Lighthouse. Every interaction helps this message reach minds that are searching for steadiness in chaos. In the next video, we'll confront a modern battlefield, one that most people enter every day without armor, discipline, or awareness. A place where attention is constantly attacked and inner freedom quietly erodes. If you want to understand how a Stoic would face that arena, you won't want to miss it. We'll leave you with a final thought that captures the essence of Stoic leadership. Epictetus warned, "No man is free who is not master of himself." See you in the next video.